This video is sponsored by Skillshare. What happens when a country wages war on an airline? Well, you found the right video to get the answer, because Wizz Air is currently in a full-on standoff with almost an entire nation, one of the world's richest, in fact, Norway. After trying to enter the domestic Norwegian market last fall, the airline has received what, by all measures, is an unprecedented wave of resistance and attacks. But are the attacks warranted? And should Wizz Air be stopped? What are they doing that's causing such an outrage, and why did they get into this situation to begin with? Before we continue with the video, did you know that your odds of being awesome increase by 800% when you subscribe to a YouTuber you like? It takes 1 second, costs nothing, and when subscribing to me, Nonstop Dan, you become part of the Nonstop Nation, a community of passionate travel and aviation lovers who are 800% more awesome. If you don't know Wizz Air, you may be thinking, what is this unheard of airline that I'm wasting my time on? And why is their name so uncomfortably close to another word that ends with is? I'd assume a professional company doesn't want to be associated with that word. If you do know the airline, odds are you associate them with Eastern Europe, so you may be thinking, what on earth are they doing in Norway? Well, Wizz Air is a complicated and fascinating airline with a short but explosive history. Wizz Air is Europe's youngest major airline. Founded only 18 years ago in 2003, the airline was always meant to be a hardcore low-cost carrier in Ryanair fashion. They were created at a critical time in European history, as Eastern Europe was rapidly developing. In fact, the airline's home country of Hungary, along with 7 other Eastern European nations, joined the European Union the exact month the airline launched. This, of course, was not a coincidence. Joining the European Union allows citizens of a new member country to live and work in other member countries. What did that mean? There would be an influx of Eastern Europeans traveling and moving to Western and Northern Europe, and they needed affordable transportation to bring them there and back. Ryanair had a notably small presence in Eastern Europe unless flying from existing hubs, so there was a void to be filled. A group of entrepreneurs contacted the former CEO of Hungary's national airline Malev, asking if he wanted to come on board. Along with an initial investment from low-cost investment giant Indigo Partners, owners of Frontier, JetSmart, and Volaris, the odds they would successfully launch were decent, which is far better than most startup airlines. So where does a new Hungarian airline start operations? Between Poland and London, of course. Wizz Air was an almost instant success. Just 4 years after launching, they created a Ukrainian subsidiary, and 3 years after that, they were profitable. In fact, between 2012 and 2020, Wizz Air reported consistently high profits, with a record in 2019 of almost 300 million euros. Their strategy for success has been twofold. Firstly, to connect Eastern Europe to important cities in Western Europe like London, Frankfurt, and Stockholm. The other aspect of this was connecting secondary cities in Western European countries to markets that, without Wizz Air service, would have little to no demand. They would cater to Eastern Europeans in Western Europe, of course, but just like Ryanair, Wizz Air would create demand simply by pricing the flights so low that people would think, okay, why the hell not? Let's take a weekend in Gdansk, Tuzla, or Skopje. Ryanair and Wizz Air have a lot in common, much more than EasyJet and Norwegian. Both airlines operate an extremely diverse network with dozens of hubs all over Europe, allowing them to reach massive scale. Most of their flights also happen to be international because that's where the money lies when operating in Eastern Europe. The most important thing to note is that Wizz Air has very few hubs in places that are well served by legacy or full-service airlines. With the exception of London, none of their other European hubs had any significant competition from legacy carriers. This is an important part of the low-cost model in Europe, especially for young airlines. giants like British Airways will go after competition as soon as it tries to encroach on its markets by implementing predatory pricing. British Airways can keep this up, but usually the smaller and newer airline cannot. Therefore, low-cost airlines, especially younger ones, are best off serving secondary cities without much other service. Wizz Air did this until recently. In the past few years, Wizz Air has set up a massive hub in Vienna, competing directly with Austrian Airlines. Lufthansa Group, understandably, is not happy about this, but they have the pricing power to keep Wizz Air out of Austrian's most important markets. Additionally, Wizz Air recently set up a subsidiary in Abu Dhabi, operating flights to vacation destinations around Southern Europe and the Middle East. Here, they compete directly with Etihad on some routes. As Wizz Air grows and maintains profits consistently like it has, it becomes an increasingly large threat for legacy airlines and becomes less vulnerable. They have enormous economies of scale, allowing them to undercut legacy airlines on price and compete with them much more effectively on routes that these airlines already serve. This brings us to the next step in Wizz Air's expansion, a move I honestly didn't see coming. In October 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, Wizz Air announced it would launch domestic flights in Norway, first to 3 cities, and then they quickly changed it to a massive 10 cities all over the country. Now, they already served a significant number of routes to the Norwegian capital Oslo and other Norwegian cities to shuttle workers from Eastern Europe, but this expansion seemed to come out of nowhere. Wizz Air probably saw a golden opportunity. Although passenger numbers were down by 70% in Norway, the previous biggest low-cost airline, Norwegian, was struggling to keep operating any flights, and the prospects looked grim for their survival. SAS, the biggest domestic player, has the benefit of customer loyalty, but then again, the value for money is abysmal given the low-cost service level at full-service prices. Lastly, Widerøe has a monopoly on many smaller Norwegian routes, but doesn't compete in many of their primary business markets. Wizz Air also noticed that government restrictions were harming international demand, so they were wise to focus on increasing domestic flights where they could. The last interesting part of this is that Norway is an incredibly rich country with high prices. This has potential to be a great market for an airline to enter domestically, unlike many of Wizz Air's Eastern European hub countries. Entering will be expensive, but there are ways to avoid some of the high costs in Norway, and this is where the war begins. Wizz Air is not actually hiring much staff in Norway. Instead, Wizz Air is flying pilots into Norway and stationing them there for less than 3 months to avoid Norwegian pay and benefit laws. These pilots are sole proprietors paid by the hour. They also don't receive any pensions and don't have job security, meaning they can be fired at any time without notice. Another major issue for the Norwegians has been Wizz Air's opposition to unions. In Norway, it's illegal for a domestically operating company not to provide the option for employees to unionize should they wish. Wizz Air's CEO made it clear that they would not allow employees to form unions and have even fired employees for trying to unionize in the past, which raised questions about whether the company could actually operate in Norway or not. Now keep in mind that, like Ryanair, Wizz Air is not intended to be a career airline. Yes, their labor practices are by many measures abusive and wrong, but at the same time, the airline provides a vital stepping stone for future careers at legacy airlines by allowing junior pilots to accrue flight hours. Wizz Air hires cheap labor with little experience and never promises a lifelong career. Well, when this information reached Norwegian media, a frenzy of criticism was unleashed on the airline. As soon as the domestic routes were announced, Norwegian labor organization NITO publicly committed to not allowing any of their 91,000 employees to fly Wizz Air for any work-related missions. This led to a wave of similar commitments from major companies in Norway, including the national energy distributor, who in December published a full-page ad together with other companies in Norwegian media saying, "Get Wizz Air out of Norway." But it gets even crazier because it's not only private companies boycotting the airline. Several city governments decided they would avoid the airline as well, and craziest of all is that even Norway's prime minister said she would not fly the airline. So, what a great way to launch a business expansion, right? They say all PR is good PR, but in this case, that's not necessarily true, since companies, not individuals, are choosing to boycott the airline as a consequence. Regular passengers don't usually care who they fly with as long as it's cheap, but companies have to consider PR, and in this case, having their employees fly Wizz Air could generate lots of domestic backlash. Wizz Air, understandably, was not thrilled with their not so warm welcome. But what do they expect in the Arctic Circle? I mean, come on. In response, they decided to sue several companies, including the National Energy Distributor, for anti-competitive behavior. Basically, they were pissed the companies were trying to impact public opinion against flying the airline. Wizz Air issued statements claiming they were being bullied out of the Norwegian market, which is technically true. Regardless of whether or not we agree with the boycott, the intended effect is clearly to get Wizz Air to stand down and scrap any expansion plans, and it's being done by exposing the airline publicly. Then, Norway started their counterattack, since they weren't really satisfied with Wizz Air's decision to try to change the boycott rather than changing their labor practices. The mayor of Bergen, one of Norway's biggest cities, said, "I'm amazed that a company, in this case Wizz Air, that wants to establish itself in Norway, chooses to attack municipalities and counties instead of spending time to clean up its own unacceptable working conditions." Wow. This back and forth is interesting because Wizz Air doesn't seem like the type of airline, to me, that simply stands back and lets itself be attacked. Clearly, they're within their legal rights operating domestic flights in Norway, so there's no legal route to kick them out. It seems to me that all the backlash might actually cause Wizz Air to take an even more aggressive approach in Norway, especially once travel starts again. Cash is not a problem for the airline, as they have enough money to pay for another 2 years of operating costs, and this means they could operate at a loss in Norway simply to harm domestic carriers. The only scenario where they would back down, as I see it, is if the boycott becomes widespread enough that virtually no Norwegian would ever step on a Wizz Air flight, regardless of the price. And that is the rundown on where we currently are in this war between Norway and Wizz Air. One last strange thing to note before we go is that Norway, an oil-rich country, is actually a major investor in Wizz Air through its sovereign wealth fund. Their investment is valued at 60 million euros. That's irony if I ever saw it. Do you remember the feeling of being a child and discovering things you'd never known before? Remember that feeling of curiosity and excitement of knowing something new? Well, it's never too late to learn new things with today's video sponsor, Skillshare. I've said it before, but Skillshare is my favorite way to learn new skills online in an awesome community of millions of curious learners. We love Skillshare because there are no ads and thousands of curated classes on any topic you can imagine. Whether you're into music, photography, or anything else, there are classes for you. I just took Animating with Ease in After Effects by Jake Bartlett and learned the basics of After Effects, which was far overdue for me. You can try Skillshare Premium for free and get it for less than $10 a month with an annual membership by clicking the link at the top of the description. But be quick, because only the first 1,000 of you get a free trial.